Hello, my name is Philip Marshall. I'm the director of the London Library, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to our LitFest, celebrating 180 years of the London Library. Today we're absolutely thrilled and honoured to be joined by Salman Rushdie, who's with us to celebrate the 40th anniversary of his trailblazing classic, Midnight's Children. Salman joined the London Library some years before the publication of this wonderful novel, and we're very proud to be able to name him among our most distinguished members. This event is in partnership with English Pen, with whom Salman has been heavily involved, including being a former president of Pen America. Like the library and Midnight's Children, English Pen is also celebrating a significant anniversary this year. It was founded in 1921 and is one of the world's oldest human rights organisations, working to promote literature and the right to freedom of expression through a range of campaigns, events, projects and publications. Today's event is part of English Pen's Common Currency Centenary programme, which brings together writers, readers and activists for events, residencies, campaigns and conversations across the UK and Ireland. For more information, please see their website englishpen.org/common-currency. Salman Rushdie is the author of 14 novels, including Midnight's Children, for which he won the Booker Prize and the Best of Booker, Shame, The Satanic Verses, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, and Keyshot. He was the winner of the 2014 Pen Pinter Prize and in 2007 was knighted for services to literature. Chairing the event is Nikita Lalwani. Nikita is a novelist and screenwriter, born in Rajasthan and raised in Wales. Her first book, Gifted, was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and won the Desmond Elliott Prize. The Village won a Jerwood Fiction Uncovered Award, and her latest, You People, is optioned for television by World Productions. She's a writer on the upcoming television series The Offenders, created by Stephen Merchant. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and is also a member of the London Library. Please send in your questions for Salman via the chat function, which Nikita will come to at the end of the discussion. Over to you, Nikita and Salman.
Well, it's an utter joy for me to be able to be involved in this discussion. Salman, so hello and great to meet you on this platform.
Yeah.
I just finished rereading Midnight's Children, which is, for so many writers of my generation, an incredibly important book and a formative book for me as a writer. I remember when I first discovered it, I was in my late teens, and it was just this huge phantasmagoric symphony. It felt like a big act of courage, in that it was groundbreaking in so many ways. And now it's 40 years since the book came out. It's a long time. How do you feel when you look at it now? It's got enduring appeal, and yet it's a very different time from the one when it came out. What's your instinctive feeling when you think about the fact that it's been 40 years?
Well, my instinctive feeling is that I feel old. That's the first thing. What is nicest really is that I remember when it came out all that time ago, that it had an enormous success among younger readers. You know, that I mean, it was very popular in universities and things like that. And if there were people who didn't so much like it, they tended to be older, more kind of conventional readers, but very popular among young. And what is interesting to me is that still seems to be the case. That 40 years later, it still seems to be younger readers who respond to it best. Even though these readers would not have been born when the book was first published. So that feels nice. I like it that it speaks to the young. And when I look, I mean, I don't very often open it, to tell you the truth. I mean, the last time I had to open it was when I was working on the screenplay of the film that Deepa Mehta made. And I mean, I guess I thought what you always think if you look at a book you wrote a long time ago. There are bits of it where I think, that's kind of good. I mean, who wrote that?
That's funny.
And at other times I think that's not so good. Who wrote that? But I mean, I think it's one of the things about finishing a book is that in a way, it stops being your property. It leaves you, and I think it would be a great mistake to try and fiddle with it. It is what it is.
Well, that's really interesting that it's still popular with young readers. I was in my late teens when I first discovered it, and the central premise of that army of children who were born within the first hour of Indian independence, having special powers, that really appealed to me. And I remember, fittingly, it entered my dreams, and those characters were in my dreams, much like the book. Where dreams are very important in the book. You can enter a dream and you can change or spy on someone. And I think, I mean, I was just old enough. I was in my late teens. It was probably too old to be thinking that you still had a chance of being telepathic or being able to divine emotions through your nose or do the kinds of things that happen in the book. But it's interesting that younger readers respond to it in that way. You've recently, you've got a new book of essays coming out, and you've said in the past and more recently that you've written a defense of the wonder tale of wonder, when we're subjected to so much realism. So you're interested in fiction that's come down from Don Quixote, for example, rather than through the realist mode. Can you tell me why you think that realism has had such a huge moment in the Sun?
Well, one of the things that you learn if you stick around in the world of books for any length of time is that there is fashion in reading, and that things that were fashionable go out of fashion, come back into fashion. It's like anything else. And I think what happened around the time that Midnight's Children came out was that there was a desire amongst readers for less conventional books, for more adventurous, kind of formally and linguistically more adventurous books. And I think a lot of us who were beginning, young and starting out then, benefited from that. I think, in kind of my generation in England, writers like Martin Amis and Ian McEwan and Julian Barnes and Kazuo Ishiguro and Angela Carter and Jeanette Winterson and so many of us, I think, benefited from readers being curious to see something new. And I think lately a kind of more conventional, a fondness for more conventional books has returned. And that's just how it goes. One of the things I read that made an impression on me a long time ago was this essay that Milan Kundera wrote, in which he suggests that the novel has two parents, one of which is Samuel Richardson's novel Clarissa, from which descends the realist tradition. And the other, he said, was Lawrence Stern's novel Tristram Shandy, from which comes this more antic, playful tradition. I just think he's wrong about Tristram Shandy, because Tristram Shandy derives very strongly from Don Quixote. Actually, there's two characters of Uncle Toby and Corporal Trim in Tristram Shandy who are consciously taken from Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. So I would say that Cervantes and Richardson are the parents of these two traditions. And well, Kundera's argument was that there has been much more realism than surrealism in the history of the novel. And so he said that the possibilities of writing like that had been more or less exhausted. Very hard to do something new in that vein. And that if you wanted to do new things, this other tradition, this more playful tradition, was where the new remained to be done.
Well, he's really interesting on that, isn't he? Because he also talks about the synthetic novel and the possibilities of the novel, sort of excited by the polyhistoric novel and how you can fuse poetry, memoir, fact, fiction, and be sort of playful with it, as you say, ludic in your approach. And I remember that in your essay in Imaginary Homelands, you talk about how there are deliberate inconsistencies in the narrative of Midnight's Children. That's also playful, but also a kind of a political point, is it? To remember things differently, to remember things in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, one of the things that happened when I was thinking about the book is that I had this very strong memory of the war between India and China in the 1960s, and I remembered how in Bombay, where my family was living, how frightened people were, and how because the Chinese seemed to be getting the better of the conflict, and people were worried that lost one empire, we might be about to have another one inflicted on us. All this kind of conversation, and I remember talking to my mother about it, and she said, "Don't be silly. You were at boarding school in England. You were, you weren't here." And when I checked, she was, of course, correct. But my memory insisted that I had been there, and so I found that really interesting. That the kind of truth we construct for ourselves out of memory sometimes has nothing to do with the actual truth, but we believe in it very passionately. I mean, even though my mother told me that, I still believe that I was in India listening to all these conversations, but it clearly wasn't. So then I thought that the novel should be, in a way, about memory and about the kind of distortions that memory can make, how you can misremember things, and the misremembering can be important. So it sort of shaped my sense of how the book would be written.
Yeah, misremembering is part of I guess, the tectonic plates of the narrative and how the narrative shifts. And Salim is telling the story, but he's constantly being berated for getting it wrong or slowing it down, or the holes in the narrative. Sometimes he confesses that he deliberately makes things up. I mean, it's not that dissimilar to writing fiction in any form, really, is it? I mean,
no. I mean, it's just self-conscious about it. That's all. I mean, I think we all do this all the time. But he talks about it.
But yeah, and there's another image in the book when I went back to it just this week, which felt like it was about the act of narration or the act of telling stories, which is the fact that at the start of the book, one of the pleasing symmetries in the book is the hole that's in the chest of Dr. Aziz and the hole that he looks through in order to see the woman that he would marry. And he's kind of possessed by putting together all of the different parts of her body. He's only seen them separately. And she's this headless woman in his mind as he goes around, and I guess her limbs are in all different, arranged in many different ways. But she doesn't have a head, or the parts. There's something going on there about the parts being different than the whole. And that to me felt like a really great image for the act of writing. And I wanted to know, has the act of writing changed for you? There's so much in the book. It all coalesces together in this sort of impressive way. Have you changed the way in which you write over the years?
Well, I mean, I think there's a thing that hasn't changed, which is just kind of this urge to write everything books, to to write books that try to be as capacious and inclusive as it's possible to be without just collapsing under the weight of that. What Henry James used to call loose, baggy monsters.
Right.
Which he would say that, wouldn't he? But what has changed is how I do it. That's to say, when I wrote Midnight's Children, I needed an enormous amount of architecture. I had to really plan the skeleton of the book in great detail before I was able to write it. Before I could start putting flesh on the skeleton. And partly that's because of the idea of this family's life, this young man's life, boy and young man's life, being so closely mapped onto events in the history of the country. So I had to know how those two maps sat on top of each other. Otherwise it would just make no sense at all. But now, I mean, for example, when I was writing the most recent novel, Kishat, I mean, of course, I had some kind of a map. But I'm much more prepared now to see what happens on the page, and to see writing as a discovery, more than as some sort of writing out what you've already planned. So that really has changed, and that's not suddenly. It's sort of been happening gradually over the years. And the way I think about it is, if you use a kind of musical analogy, that it's the difference between symphonic composition and jazz, or to use an Indian analogy, the rag, where there clearly is a structure, but there's an enormous amount of room within that structure to make discoveries, to make musical discoveries. And I think much more like that now.
But of course, going fully jazz can be very dangerous, in terms of whether the sort of meaning of the book or the artistic project is at stake.
It can be a complete mess if you don't look out. I remember I had to once interview Toni Morrison for the BBC when she published her novel Jazz.
Right.
And I remember saying to her, "Oh, okay, so your book's called Jazz. Have you used a kind of jazz technique in writing it? I mean, is there improvisation? Is there, and she said, well, she kind of cheated. She said, well, I want to make you feel that that's what I did. And she wouldn't own up to whether she really did it or not. But it does feel like that novel. It does feel that it has some of the kind of freedom of jazz. But I think, you can't avoid being your own best critic. You have to, I mean, if as Hemingway said, if you have to have a shit detector. And if you don't know when it's bad, you don't know when it's good. So
another shit detector is sometimes one's editor, right? So how does that work for you then? Do you work closely with your editor, or?
I don't. I work closely eventually. I mean, that's to say, I'm very nervous to show work in progress. I just think it's so fragile at that stage. Like if I write something and I show it to you and you say, well, it's not there yet, then I know it's not there yet, but I get depressed.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is to bring it to a point where I feel ready to show it. I mean, that's usually, a finished version of it. And embarrassment is a very good test. If you're embarrassed to show it to people, it means it's not ready. There's a point when you're not embarrassed and you're kind of eager for somebody to read it. And then I listen very, very carefully to what, for example, what my editor would say. And that can be very helpful. I mean, I've been lucky over the years to have a number of really extraordinary editors. I've been edited in England by Liz Calder and Dan Franklin, and now Michal Shavit at Cape, and in America I've been edited by Bob Gottlieb at Knopf and Susan Camel at Random House, and then sadly after she died, now Robin Desser at Random House, and actually in Canada by Louise Dennis, who's been a long time, probably the longest running friend and editor of all of those. And so I'm lucky, I have very, very smart readers to read what I do. And as I say, once I've got it to that point where I'm eager for people to read it, then I really listen. I mean, I'm not saying I do everything that people want. But for example, I'll tell you a funny story. With Midnight's Children, there was originally a second audience character. He wasn't just telling the story to Padma in the pickle factory. There was another character.
Oh, really?
To whom he was sending. Anyway, that's an oral conversation. But I had another character to whom he was sending written pages, and who was responding to the written pages. And Liz Calder and 2 or 3 other people at Cape who read it just said, you just don't need this character. You really don't need her. You've already got the audience figure that you need. You don't need 2. And so I got a little defensive. And then eventually I thought, okay, I'll just try this. And I remember saying to Liz, if it proves to be very difficult to do this, then I'm going to believe that I'm right and you're wrong. And I took the character out of the book in 24 hours.
Oh, wow. Right.
I mean, it just fell out, and the moment it was gone, I thought, oh, this is much better. And I'm now unbelievably grateful for that, because the book would have had this very clunky thing in it, which it now doesn't have because of the editors.
But it's interesting because embarrassment, I think also is a really good way of judging. I don't know, when you're reading your pages back the next day, you can feel a twinge of embarrassment, think, what was I doing? It's always a good way to judge whether you want something to be in the world. But if you get too embarrassed too quickly, you would never have written Midnight's Children, would you? Because it's sort of this huge, unabashed kind of leap into the unknown, isn't it? And that's got to be embarrassing.
It was scary. It was scary because what had happened is that, I'd written quite a lot before, and most of it had never been published. And the one thing that was published, my first novel, Grimus, was, to put it mildly, was not well received. Except, I'm very proud to say, by Ursula K. Le Guin, who loved it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I thought, okay, if Ursula Le Guin likes it, it can't be all bad, but essentially nobody else liked it. And so I had to really rethink a lot about my own writing, what did I really want to do, etc. And in the end, if I think back to this kid, I was like 27, 28 years old, and I just thought I wanted to take the biggest risk I could think of taking, and if I was going to fail, I wanted to go down in flames. So, and really, I wrote this book with very low expectations, and when it was finished, I just thought, I hope it gets published. There was no guarantee that it would be published. And when it did get taken by Cape in England and by Knopf in America, I thought that was kind of enough, to have these 2 great publishing houses take the book on. And I thought, if a few hundred people who I don't personally know or are not related to me buy copies of it, that'll be nice too. But I had no idea of what was going to happen, and wouldn't have dared to imagine that was going to happen.
Well, Salim, he, as you've already mentioned, he and all the children who are born at midnight or within the hour from midnight, their personal trajectories is very closely knitted with the trajectory of India, and the global story is the personal, is the political, and the idea of multiplicity seems to be very important then and in your subsequent works, plurality. And you've said that you felt like, even though you grew up in a Muslim household in Bombay, the Hindu myths were open to you,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you could access them. Nothing was off limits.
Yeah. I still think that. Yeah.
And
I think.
yeah,
Just think everything is there for everybody. It's a question of whether you make good or bad use of it.
and people at the time made comment on whether the ending of Midnight Children was pessimistic or not. And optimism and pessimism are quite important in the book. Optimism is a virus that anyone can catch, that has the power to do damage. And do you think the ending is pessimistic now, or
No,
not?
I mean, I think it looks ludicrously optimistic. I compared to what's happened, and that's a great sadness to me. I would have liked it to be proved wrong. For the world to the country and the world to have gone in a better direction.
Yeah.
But
in which direction? So what would you say is
well, it's
is
well, one
now
thing.
optimistic about the ending? What happens at the ending, and what happened in life?
Well, at the ending, there's a next generation that's just been born. The Salim's generation, coming to. I mean, he's 31 or so at the end of the book, and he's become a father, and the suggestion is that this next generation will be more impressive. It'll be kind of tougher and more, and want to do more and achieve more, etc. And so the optimism in the book is placed in that next generation. And I'm not sure it lived up to it. I think, well, one of the things that, as you were saying about Hindu and Muslim culture being available, that's basically a secularist worldview,
Yeah.
and that idea of India has been under relentless attack in the last 15, 20 years. And the advocates of that idea of India, the kind of founding fathers, Nehru, Gandhi, etc., have also been under relentless attack. And there's a deliberate attempt to replace that idea of India with an exclusively Hindu idea of India, in which all other people are in some way secondary, and that's led to a lot of trouble. Yeah.
So that idea of India, you've always been outspoken about Hindu extremism, or the Hindu idea of India, that very monochrome or single vision, rather than a multiple, one that contains multitudes in that way in terms of faith. Do you feel like Midnight's Children still resonates in that sense, or do you think that things have moved on? In terms of, I'm just trying to kind of say what I mean here, which is something to do with writerly responsibility, I guess. So Midnight's Children, you wrote in a sense to embody the secular ideal, and now there are lots of pressures or demands made of writers to be, in inverted commas, responsible in some way for for their output. How does that strike you?
Well, first of all, Midnight Children, when I was writing it, the thing that was happening in India at that time was the emergency. And I think the book is very much a product of its time. It comes out of, first of all, my shock and disappointment about the emergency, that someone like Indira Gandhi would do that. And yeah, I mean, I remember thinking, when I was writing the book, the emergency was still going on; it hadn't ended. And I thought, I can't end it in the book if it hasn't ended in the world. And then she called this election, which she thought she would win, and she miscalculated and lost the election. And I felt felt kind of grateful to her. She'd given me the end. She'd given me the end of my book. So I felt like writing her a thank you note, which was probably unwise. But I do think that the book comes out of that moment. And so yes, obviously things are different now, and the book couldn't be written in that way now, and shouldn't be. I mean, you can't write a book of the late 1970s, early 80s, 40 years later. Different things would come to mind to write about, and I think there's a lot of wonderful Indian writers right now writing those books. And I mean, I hope, I haven't finished myself, actually. I mean, in fact, one of the things that's happened during this lockdown is that I found myself thinking that, the last 3 novels certainly have been primarily set in New York City and in the United States. And I found myself thinking, well, enough of that for the moment. And going back towards an Indian subject. So I'm working on that now. So
we'll look forward to that. I think that that's interesting what you say, that it's rooted in its place and time, and yet it's had this enduring appeal because of the fabulist element, or the fact that it's.
You see, I don't know that it is. I don't know that it is because of the fabulous element. Because I mean, I remember when the book came out in the West, people tended to respond to the fabulist element. They tended to treat it as a kind of fairy tale. In India, people read it like a history book.
Yeah.
And I remember being there just after the book came out, to do some events and things. And I remember a young writer coming up to me saying, I could have written your book. I know all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, okay, that's a kind of compliment. That's like saying that the book speaks just to a reality that he knew. And so yeah, I mean, I think obviously the truth is somewhere in between those two. It's not a history book, and it's not a fairy tale. Although it has elements of both. And I think that's, my view is that if it survived because it's a good story. I mean, I think what makes things survive is story. And I've always been a strong advocate of storytelling in fiction, which not everybody wants to do. And my view is, especially if it's a big book, like Midnight Children is a very big book, physically big book. I thought, if you're going to build a big car, put a big engine in it.
Right.
And
that makes sense.
The story is the engine to me. And I mean, as a reader, I get bored very easily.
That's interesting.
Yeah, my view is keep me interested, as a reader, and I mean, the story is what keeps you interested, and people who write popular fiction know this very well. I mean, if you're like John Grisham or J.K. Rowling, well, they know perfectly well that the story is what keeps you hooked. And I mean, I think that too.
You sound like quite a demanding reader. Are you anyone's trusted reader? Does anyone send you their manuscript in order to check?
Yeah, there's a fair.
What's that like? It's quite a curious transaction, being a trusted reader, especially if you want a ton of story.
Well, the thing is that you have to tell the truth. That's the hard part. I mean, there's no point being an early reader if you just pat people on the back and say it's wonderful. And I mean, I don't expect that of people that I show it to. I don't need people to say, "Gosh, you're good." I need people to say, "I got confused here," or "You lost my attention here," or "I thought there was too much of this," or "I wanted to know more about that." That's actually more helpful. And for example, when I wrote The Enchantress of Florence, which takes place in two different places at two different times. Some of it is in India in the reign of the Emperor Akbar in the second half of the 16th century, and the other part is in Italy in the Florentine Renaissance. Some time later. So there's two times and places and sets of characters. And I really worried that, and the narrative goes back and forth between them, and I really worried that the reader would be annoyed by the jumping back and forth, and so when I showed it to a few people, I said, please tell me if this is irritating, and because I need to know. And if you get annoyed, tell me exactly where you get annoyed. And what came out of that, two or three people reading it, was I understood that I was doing too much jumping back and forth. That each section needed to be longer, and each section needed to have its own little story arc, so that people felt that they'd read a sort of complete thing, and then they would be interested to go on to the next thing. And so I reshaped the book in these longer arcs, where you stayed in one place for longer. And then I hoped that would get over the irritation problem. But I think that's, what I'm saying is that that's what you have to do. You have to be able to be absolutely honest about it.
So structure is still very important to you then, in that sense, that there's a kind of graph, you're building a graph at the same time as expending time on the individual sentence. A lot of creative writing now tends to become obsessed with the individual sentence, I find, and not enough with the overall graph of up and down as you go through the book.
I'm happy to say I've never either been taught or taught anyone creative writing. I do a bit of teaching now, and I teach at NYU, but I teach in the journalism school.
Oh, right.
And I have a graduate seminar in narrative nonfiction. One foot. So I teach this course in the way in which in the last half century or so, a large number of writers have used the techniques of the novel in order to tell true stories. And I just think it's a very interesting development, So, but yeah, I of course I think that that form is important, but I also think the level of the sentence is very important. For some reason or other, I had to reread The Great Gatsby a few years ago, and the thing that just blew my mind was the beauty of the sentences. It's the beauty of the writing is just extra. Never mind what it's about. You just want to stay with the sentences and the paragraphs. I think that matters hugely, but it's not the only thing.
Well, some of your sentences are very long and can last for a whole page. And you've got this big maximalist thing going on, but are you ever tempted to be minimalist? I know that you wrote a pop song. You wrote The Ground Beneath Her Feet with U2. The lyrics are incredibly distilled. That? What was that like?
Well, the lyrics are more or less already present in the novel, The Ground Beneath Her Feet. But, and what happened is when I had finished the manuscript, talking about getting people to read for you, because of the music industry material, I wanted some people who were in that industry to read it and tell me where the mistakes were. It wouldn't happen like this; it would happen like that. But so I sent it amongst other people to Bono, because I knew him, and what he did, he called me up and he said that he said, what did he say? He said, when I began reading your book, I was reading it like a policeman. I wanted to find out where you'd committed crimes, so I could. And he said, but then he just liked it and he stopped doing that. And when he came across this, because the main character of the novel is a songwriter, and one of the songs he writes is a song to his lost love who's been killed in an earthquake. And so he writes this song, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, because the ground opens up beneath her feet, and it has this parallel with the myth of Orpheus, and Eurydice descending into the underworld and so on. And he just said to me, he said, I've written a tune, and I really like it. And then he insisted that I went to Dublin to hear the tune. So, so, so I went to Dublin, and there was a sort of lunch at which the whole band was there, but he was, I don't know, he was in a funny way shy, and he made me come and sit in his car and listen to the demo CD that he'd made of it.
Why was it in his car? Why in his car?
I have to tell you, the sound system in Bono's car is not like the sound system in your car.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you open the trunk, it's like it's all sound system.
But was he playing at being a punter? Was it?
No, he wanted me to listen to it. He wanted me to listen to it, and he made me listen to it 3 times before he believed that I liked it. And then he went and played it to the rest of the band, and then they ended up recording it. And now it's on the reissue of All That You Can't Leave Behind. It's on there.
How was it? And did he force you to be in the video as well?
It didn't take much forcing. I mean, if somebody says Wim Wenders is making the video and we'd like you to be in it, and somebody involved is you too, I mean, you probably say yes. And I mean, I was really thrilled. And I mean, over the years, I've been at a number of U2 concerts where they've performed it, and there's something extraordinary for a literary novelist, about having a band like U2 singing your song.
Yeah.
So.
But
unfortunately, it's never happened again.
Well, we're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes, but I've still got a couple of things to ask you. You've said that story and song are critical things for humans, as important as, say, shelter, food, love. Story and song are important. But I also wanted to ask you about anger and injustice. Do you still get angry, and is that important for the engine of writing? I'm remembering, going back to Imaginary Homelands again, a moment that you describe of you described sort of casual racism quite a bit at that time, and a report has just come out recently in the UK saying that Britain isn't institutionally racist. What did you think of that? Do you think Britain's racist?
Well, what do you think I thought of it? I thought, how stupid can you get? And yeah, I mean, I want to be careful because it's 21 years since I lived in England.
Yeah.
And I've been a lot more concerned with American racism for a lot of the last 20 years.
Right.
But I don't, these things don't disappear just like that. But you're asking about anger. I mean, certainly, living in Trump's America, it was hard not to be angry every day. And now there's actually just briefly a sense of relief that decent people appear to be running the country, and the grown-ups appear to be back in charge, and that the evil bastards are still there, but they're shouting from the sidelines just for the moment. So yeah, I mean, what I don't ever want to do is to write polemical fiction, because I think that's what doesn't last for 40 years. Because we just live in an age in which the subject changes very fast. And the thing that everybody is very het up about now, they're not thinking about in 3 weeks' time. And so I think it's very dangerous to allow your work to be hooked too directly to something that outrages you. And actually, the case of Midnight Children, I worried about the fact that there was this genuine anger in me about the emergency out of which that section came, and I remember thinking, when I was writing it, there's going to be a time if this book's still in print, in a while, there's going to be a time when people are not worked up about the emergency and when they don't care about Indira Gandhi. And I thought at that point, the book is either going to get worse because that topicality disappears.
But I think that anger, that passion is part of the book's stature. So it's that anger about Indira Gandhi and the emergency is essentially about voices being suppressed, fertility being sterilized. It's an anger about eternal things as well as being about that particular time and place.
Yeah.
And every book is political.
Jailing your opponents. Yeah. Oh, I believe that. I believe that every book is political in the end. I'm just saying I don't want it to be too issue driven, because issues change. And so I think I mean, I've been a writer who is very interested in the interlocking of public affairs and private lives, and trying to understand how those things connect. Are we able to change the world we live in, or does the world we live in just crush us? Who's doing what to whom? And that interests me. But what I don't want is to wag a finger, because I don't like books that preach as a reader. So it's more about creating a world that contains a vision of the world and inviting you to engage with that.
Great. And I've got some questions that have come through from some of the people watching. So I'm just going to put some of those to you now. Firstly, Gillian asks, Gillian says, I find poetry in your writing. Do you write poetry separately? And if so, why do you choose poetry to convey certain ideas rather than the novel? A question about the form that you use.
I'm very flattered that you think that the work is occasionally poetry-like. I've published exactly one poem in my life, so I don't think of myself as a working poet. But what I do is read a lot of poetry, and actually when I'm writing a novel, I don't read much fiction because I kind of don't want to be infected by somebody else's way of doing it. But I do read a lot of poetry. I mean, like every day, at some point, I will just randomly go and, it's not even that there are particular poets. I'll just randomly go and pick a book of poetry off the bookshelf and read it for 10 or 20 minutes. It's just, and it really is about language. I mean, this is coming back to what you were saying about the level of the sentence. I think that there's no reason why a novel should not be as carefully written as a poem. It just makes it take longer to do, but that's all right. So yeah, I do use poetry to tell myself to pay attention to language.
That's a great tip for sometimes possibly, I think, breaking block as well.
Yeah.
Poetry would probably help with that, whereas often reading fiction can contribute to block or writer's block because it's, as you say, it can pollute what you're trying to do. It can also influence it in a good way, but poetry,
Poetry, it's useful.
Useful. Anna asks, what inspired the Jaguar smile?
Well, what happened is that in the mid-'80s, I guess, I'd been paying attention to the Contra War in Nicaragua. That's just in London, living in London. I was interested in it, and I went to a couple of meetings of what was called the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign. And then two things happened. One is that I was in the middle of writing a novel called The Satanic Verses, and I was kind of stuck. It was not going right. And the other thing is that I went to a literary festival in New York, in which I met a number of members of the Frente Sandinista, and they invited me to go to Nicaragua. And I thought, it might just be really good for me to leave my problematic novel alone and go and look at people with real problems, like having to fight a war against the United States of America through its proxies. So I went to Nicaragua and I was just possessed by it in some way. And I came back and I thought the only way I'm going to get rid of this and be able to get back to my novel is to write it out, and so I just sat down and wrote it at really, for me, very high speed. And then again, wonderful editorial intervention. I showed it to Sunny Mehta at Knopf, and he literally line edited it. He went through it, and in all cases, he asked for more. Because one of the difficult things about writing about somewhere like Nicaragua is to know how much you can expect your readers to know. How much of what's been in the news can you expect that your readers will retain? And he went through the entire manuscript saying, "What's this? When did that happen? You haven't told me enough here. I want more there." And so the initial manuscript, which was about 90 pages long, ended up being kind of twice that, because of him. And then it was published very fast because it was published. I thought if this book has any purpose at all, it should be able to contribute to the conversation while this event is still taking place, the Contra War. So that's how that happened. And then I was able to get back and finish the Satanic Verses, and that's another story.
That's a whole other story. Moving on to Zoe, if you write in the jazz style and find yourself in a knot, what do you do to get through it? Is it poetry again? I guess that's me asking.
No, it's not. It's just hammering away at it. Actually, there's no simple. There's no get out of jail card. You just have to hammer away at it. What I have found, which may be a useful craft tip, is that when you get stuck somewhere, as you say, when it gets knotted up, the problem is never where you've got stuck. The problem is, it could be 1 page before, it could be 50 pages before. Something has not been fully imagined or properly imagined, which eventually brings the wheels grinding to a halt. And you have to find out where the problem is. And as I say, it could be 10 lines earlier, or it could be 50 pages earlier. And when you find that, then the book starts to move again. So in a way, that moment where the book grinds to a halt, which happens to everybody writing every book, is a good sign, because it's telling you there's a problem, go find it. And when you find it, the book moves. That's as far as I can say. That's what works for me.
So it's about tackling your own fears in a way, because it can be quite excruciating to admit that something's not working.
Yeah. Writing books is very scary stuff, and it doesn't get less scary with age. Let me tell you. The fact that this book of essays coming out is, I think, my 20th published book, and it literally doesn't get easier. You might think it does, but I think it gets more difficult, actually. Because I think when you're a writer starting out, very often writers starting out have something that's driving them to express, whether it's an event in their lives or a bee in their bonnet, or, there's something that drives them onto the page, and in the case of some writers, that can keep you going for a lifetime, as it did with Joyce, as it did with Faulkner, and so on. But in most cases, at some point, you run out of that material. That is the thing you started with. And then you have the problem of the second act. What do you do next? So, it's scary.
Well, that leads to our next question, which is from Shan. What's your view on the genre of magical realism nowadays? What's changed in the past 40 years or so?
Well, what's changed is it's much less fashionable than it was. So there's that. But what I actually think is that term, magic realism, is best used to describe a group of Latin American writers from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, roughly that 20-year period, of whom obviously Garcia Marquez is the most celebrated. But a whole bunch of them: Carlos Fuentes, Julio Cortázar, Isabel Allende, a whole group of writers. Because it feels as if they were embarked on a project where they were, in a way, like Picasso and Braque, they were looking at each other's work, you know, and taking it forward. Otherwise, I mean, there obviously is a kind of writing that is not naturalistic, and that writing occurs in every literature every so often. You could say that in Russian literature you have, I don't know, Dead Souls, you have The Master and Margarita, you have books like that, and you have French surrealism, and you have what in the 70s in America what used to be called fabulism, and they're essentially all the same thing. They're sort of local variations of the same thing. And my view is that there are many ways to skin a cat, and I don't think of myself as essentially a magic realist writer or essentially a realist writer. I think you use the tools that seem appropriate for the thing you're trying to make, and the way I think of it really is, again, a musical analogy. I think if you have the orchestra in front of you, sometimes you can write for the violin and sometimes you can write for the piano, and it's nice to have the orchestra, to have all these different ways of making music, and you use the instruments that suit what's in your head. So I mean, I think that, like all forms, this magic realism, as it's described, will stick around, and so will realism. Nothing ever goes away. It's just a question of who's doing what with what, and sometimes one kind of writing is more interesting, and sometimes another. And you are stuck with being the writer that you are. You can't. I can't suddenly turn into a writer that I'm not. And so I just have to hope that enough people stick with me, in or out of fashion.
I think that even though magical realism doesn't dominate the literary charts, as it were, there's still a desire for books that are influenced by you or by Angela Carter in the feminist tradition. Thinking of writers like Helen Oyeyemi and Rana Dasgupta.
Yes. Oh, very much so.
And it's just that they're not the dominant force that we're seeing.
I also think, how can I put this? It's something, magic realism, breaking the rules, is something which maybe writers of color do more naturally than white writers, because the dominant culture believes that the world is what it is. People from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from wherever, Native Americans, Black Americans, they all know that the world isn't what it is. The world is what it is because somebody's telling you it's like that. And actually, maybe you need to describe it differently. And I think certainly I agree with what you say about Helen Oyeyemi and Rana Dasgupta, but I think one of the most interesting things that's happening in American literature now is that, to my mind, the most interesting writing is being done either by relatively new immigrant writers or by Black writers. It's either Jhumpa Lahiri, Junot Diaz, Viet Thanh Nguyen, or it's Jasmine Ward, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Tracy K. Smith, Natasha Trethewey. The most interesting work is being done by either Black writers or by descendants of recent immigrants. And meanwhile, the dominant white narrative is pretty realistic. And I have some question marks about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That connection you've just made goes back to what you've called also the broken mirror, or being the stereoscopic approach, being inside and outside the culture at once. Gives you a rare power, doesn't it?
Yeah, I believe so. I think this is in a way, an advantage of having a history from somewhere else. Having a different language, a different music in your head, as well as the language that's around. I think it gives you something. I mean, obviously, it's quite a difficult fate being an immigrant in the West right now. But that's something to write about as well.
And just a final question from Bella. You've answered part of it, but one of her questions is, tell us some of your favourite books that have been published in the last few years. You've just given us a stonking list of brilliant
There's
writers.
your reading list. Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, we've got that.
Yeah, yeah.
But just lastly, do you share Kazuo Ishiguro's fears about a contemporary climate of fear causing young writers to self-censor?
Yeah, I know he said that. I don't know is the answer. I mean, there's a problem of, if you ask me to project myself into the minds of a writer in his or her mid-20s, I kind of can't do it. My instinct is that writers are very bloody-minded people, and good writers will just write what they're going to write. And that's my experience as a reader of the history and the world of literature. That people with much bigger problems than political correctness, people in countries where it's actually dangerous, physically dangerous to say what you think, people still say what they think. I mean, when Osip Mandelstam wrote a poem in which he made fun of Stalin's mustache, he was told that might not be too smart because Stalin probably wouldn't like you to make fun of his mustache. But Mandelstam published the poem. I mean, his life was destroyed by it. He died in a labor camp. But as I always say at the end of this story, the poetry of Mandelstam has outlived the Soviet Union. So there's that too.
Yeah. So write what you're going to write. Be bloody-minded.
Yeah. I mean, just why? Otherwise, why do it?
Yeah.
If you feel that you have to censor yourself, then the best way to censor yourself is not to write the book. I mean, I have too great a reverence for the art of literature, to be interested in people who want to limit their own expression. An enormous number of books that, when they came out, were considered to be in some way wrong-minded, became the classics of the next generation. I mean, Madame Bovary was considered to be pornographic, if you can imagine that, and now, I mean, we can admire Flaubert for many things, but probably not for exciting sexual passion.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that sometimes literature does that. Sometimes it's ahead of its time. Sometimes books have to teach people how to read them. And I'm talking about Kazuo Ishiguro. I remember after his beautiful first 3 books, he just made this enormous change of direction, and writing a much more surrealistic kind of book. And I remember the first book he wrote like that, but there were a lot of very puzzled responses in the media, because he was supposed to be the author of The Remains of the Day, and why aren't you doing that anymore? And I remember saying to him, was he worried about the way in which people were responding to this book? And he said, no, I'm just going to write 3 more like that, and then they'll understand what I'm doing. and like, 3 books later, he wrote Never Let Me Go, and it was this huge, huge success. And what he was doing was literally teaching people how to read him, and sometimes literature has to do that.
Well, I hope we'll see many more from you now as we come to the end of this brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, Salman Rushdie.
Thank you. And thanks for doing it with me.